Okay. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Leslie Dennis, and I would like to welcome everybody to our town hall virtual meeting with Congressman Tom Malinowski. Some of you may recall that 1 year ago, at this time, we had scheduled Congressman Malinowski to a wine and cheese event at Temple Sinai, which had to be canceled because of COVID. A lot has happened in this past year, and we would appreciate a firsthand account of the happenings in District 7 and in Washington, D.C. At this point, I would like to turn the meeting over to Ian Singer, Temple President of Temple Sinai.
Thank you, Leslie. And Congressman, on behalf of a grateful Sinai community, you represent our district. I want to thank you for your leadership, generally, your openness specifically, your transparency specifically, and your courage in fighting domestic terrorism. Before COVID hit, you may recall we did have you join us during some high holidays, and it was wonderful to have you there. And importantly, at that point in time, we were very concerned in dealing with issues relating to hate. Anti-Semitism in particular was on the rise at that point in time. And so while we've done a lot and are going to be doing a lot more to harden our security at Sinai and remain aware, it would be wonderful for you to and I was also on your Interfaith Council call a few weeks ago where you spoke about what your ideas were around domestic terrorism and even focusing on legislation dealing with social media and liabilities for incitement of violence and so on. I think for our community in particular, hearing what you're up to, what the state of affairs looks like in DC relative to domestic terrorism, and whatever else then you care to speak about to your constituents. We're very grateful to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Ian. I would now like to turn over our meeting to Rabbi Glazer, who would like to say a few words. Rabbi?
So just a brief welcome. I don't want to take away from the Congressman's time. You're who we are here to hear from, not me. But a welcome again to our congregation. I'm actually new to the congregation, so we didn't meet when you were there before. I joined this synagogue in July, and I'm looking forward to getting to know you and to our partnership and to inviting you back to the temple when we're there in person to visit the community again, and as well to also visit the Holocaust Remembrance Center. So to echo what has been said, thank you for your work and thanks for being with us today. And we look forward to hearing what you have to share with us.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Tom represents New Jersey District 7 in the House of Representatives in Congress. His district includes Summit and surrounding communities of Westfield, Milburn, Short Hills, Springfield, New Providence, Mountainside. It goes on, and as far west as Hunterdon County and as far south as Somerset County. I'd just briefly like to give you a little bit of Tom's background. Tom immigrated to the United States at the age of 6 from Poland with his mother. He learned that his grandmother and great-grandmother sheltered a Jewish woman from his town throughout the war, and that they had protected several others too, in an apartment in Warsaw. This was treated in his family not as an act of heroism, but as what any normal, decent person would do. He settled in the Princeton area, attending local schools, and went on to get a bachelor's in political science from the University of California in Berkeley in 1987 and a master's of philosophy from St. Anthony's College in Oxford in 1991, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He began his career as a special assistant for Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. During President Obama's second term, Tom was nominated and confirmed to serve as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. He was praised in 2014 from both parties for his defense of human rights and his work towards ending torture. In 2017, Tom announced his candidacy for the U.S. Congress in New Jersey's 7th Congressional District. He decided to run for Congress to bring his life experiences and expertise to D.C. Tom will speak on several of the items that we have outlined in our program, and he will speak for about 10 or 15 minutes and will then take questions from the people on this call. Michael Levine, who is our Zoom producer, and thank you so much for that, will help us handle the Q&A portion of this event. Tom, we'd like to hear from you.
Thank you, Leslie. Thanks, Ian. Thank you, Rabbi Glazer, and everybody for having me today. First, I need to make clear that you guys are not off the hook for wine and cheese, just because we're still on Zoom.
Love to have you.
So we'll find a good time once we've all had the shot in the arm, and I hope that will be very, very soon. So a lot has happened in the last year, and a lot has happened in just the last 4 months since I was sworn in for my second term. In Congress, we've gone from insurrection to infrastructure, which is a pretty good thing all around, if you ask me. We've seen our country go from being essentially last in the world in our response to the coronavirus to being first in the world in vaccinating our population and getting closer to the point when we can see COVID in the rearview mirror. And these things aren't a coincidence. I think they're a reminder that politics matters, that leadership matters, that the choices we make as citizens exercising the duties and responsibilities of citizenship really do matter. Good government matters. And I hope those are the lessons that we take away from our good and bad experiences over the last several months. We've been very busy in Congress, as you know, and we were motivated in a lot of our work, of course, by an overriding desire to respond to people's immediate needs in what are hopefully the final months of the COVID crisis. So, you know, we passed a huge bill, the American Rescue Plan, that President Biden proposed and then reshaped in the House and the Senate. A lot of that bill deals with those urgent needs through stimulus checks and unemployment compensation and help for our restaurants and bailing out our struggling airlines and transit systems so that we still have them when the crisis is passed, and help for our small towns and counties, something that I work really hard to ensure that we get. For those of you in Summit, we were able to provide the municipal government with a little over $2 million, which just about takes care of the revenue shortfall for the town. That's very real. It means that the services that you depend on are going to be able to continue without your property taxes being significantly raised. So again, really something really concrete and immediate. But we also tried to do something that I think Americans are very good at historically, and that is to not let a crisis go to waste, and to do more than just the minimum necessary to patch up a hole, to heal a wound. We put in that bill a child tax credit that has been championed by Democrats and Republicans over many, many years that is sufficient, the experts tell us, to cut child poverty in America in half. We put in the bill a provision to cap monthly health insurance payments as a percentage of people's income if you're on the individual healthcare marketplace, so that the average typical middle-class family in New Jersey on that ACA marketplace will save hundreds of dollars a month on their health insurance. It was a huge issue when I first ran healthcare costs, and we just delivered in a really big way on that promise. And now, as you all, I'm sure, have been reading, we are debating the outlines, just the outlines for the moment, of a much bigger plan that President Biden has proposed to rebuild America, to fix and modernize our infrastructure. Everything from roads and bridges and tunnels, and yes, this will include the Gateway Tunnel. Don't worry, I would throw my body in front of the tracks of any legislative train involving infrastructure that didn't do that, and we will absolutely do that this year. But also fixing the stuff we don't see, the water pipes that are supposed to be delivering clean drinking water to every American, but that increasingly do not. We'll replace, under this proposal, every single lead pipe in America. We will even, I think, in a more significant way, through this legislation, speed our country's transition from a fossil fuel-based transportation system to one that's based on clean energy. Partly because of climate change, but also partly because there's an opportunity here for America to lead the world in this transition. One of the most predictable and important economic transformations in the history of the world. And I want the United States to be leading that transition. I want New Jersey to be leading it within the United States. And so we will be speeding the development of the electric car industry in America, electric buses, electric trucks. We will be greatly upgrading our national electrical grid so that we can actually deliver that electricity to all those vehicles, and spurring the development of clean power generation so that we're using wind and solar and other methods that don't contribute to climate change to generate that electricity. That's a really big deal. It's up there with building the Erie Canal. It's up there with the Transcontinental Railroad and the interstate highway system in the 1950s. And we just need to have the vision and determination to say that after we were hit hard by this horrible, tragic disease, claimed more lives than World War I, World War II combined, and we're going to come out of it with this determination to do something big and bold, as we've done so many times in our history when we're coming out of a crisis like this. So that is on our agenda, and the number one priority on my agenda over the next couple of months. It'll be good for New Jersey, good for the country, and I think we're in a position to get it done. Now, finally, you all mentioned the problem of domestic terrorism and domestic extremism, and yeah, I've been talking about it from the very, very beginning. When I was running for the first time in 2018, near the end of that campaign, the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue took place. And I did not see that as just a random act. I saw it as the culmination of a pattern of hateful ideas and hateful language being legitimized, repeated by people in positions of leadership in our country. Rhetoric demonizing immigrants, which in that case, very, very much on the mind of the person who committed the massacre. Demonizing people who are different, who come from a different place, who look differently from the majority of Americans, who worship God differently. And we know that no matter where hatred of the other starts, we know it always comes back to anti-Semitism eventually. And we've seen that pattern continue over the last 4 years. Now, a lot of the things that I wanted to get done about it are now being done. We have a unified law enforcement at the federal level, unified response. The FBI, the Justice Department the Department of Homeland Security. Their hands are no longer tied. They're no longer sneaking around the White House as they prioritize this issue. We saw the law enforcement response after January 6th. It's aggressive, it's playing offense, not defense, and I think it's making a difference. Department of Homeland Security itself, during the Trump years, their budget was significantly cut for anything other than immigration enforcement. Programs dealing with domestic terrorism were virtually eliminated. I got started while President Trump was still in office restoring that funding, and we were actually successful in restoring it in 2019 and 2020. And we're working on increasing it further right now, again, now working with leadership up and down in the administration that is supportive of this cause. And then I've carved out a particular role for myself, as I think Ian mentioned, in addressing what I think is one of the drivers of extremism and anti-Semitism in our country, and that's social media. Now, a lot of the focus in the public debate on social media, on big companies like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, is why don't you take down hate speech? Well, first, what is hate speech? And when you see it, why aren't you taking it down more often? Why aren't you getting rid of all these QAnon pages and accounts? And that's been the debate, and it's a legitimate debate. And of course, there are people on the other side who think social media has gone too far, that they're censoring too much, and we go back and forth. What I've been pointing out is that that's missing the main point. What Facebook has mostly been doing under pressure from us is putting out fires. When this hateful stuff arises, you put out the fire. The problem is their product is flammable. Facebook designs its social network, as do other social media companies, deliberately to amplify and help spread the very content that their policies then require them to take down. And the reason for this is that, well, you know that what we see on Facebook, what we see on social media, it's not what our friends post in chronological order. What we see is determined largely by an algorithm written by these companies that selects for us, recommends to us, whatever content the algorithm believes will keep us engaged, will keep us glued to the screen for the longest period of time, because that's how they make money. And what they figured out keeps us glued to the screen for the longest period of time is content that reinforces our pre-existing biases. So if you love cute animal videos, you're going to get lots of cute puppies and cute kittens. But if you're susceptible to QAnon, if you're susceptible to conspiracy theories, you're going to get that again and again and again until you're so deep down the rabbit hole that eventually you believe sincerely that storming the Capitol and hanging Mike Pence is the most patriotic and normal thing in the world, because that's all you're getting on your social media. And so I've introduced a bill to deal with that, which has gotten a lot of support, a lot of public attention. And what it basically does is to say that these big companies would no longer have legal immunity under this now increasingly famous law, Section 230. They would no longer have legal immunity for content that they promote, amplify, recommend algorithmically if that content leads to an act of terrorism or a violation of a couple of civil rights statutes that we found from the post-Civil War era that were designed to deal with hate groups like the KKK. Very relevant to what happened on January 6th and to a lot of violence, militia violence in this country in the last few years, which would mean that victims could sue in those cases. And the hope is that that liability will incentivize these companies to redesign their algorithms, their social networks essentially, to redesign how they amplify and recommend content and information to all of us, so that it's less based on addicting people by feeding them stuff that reinforces our hatreds and our fears, and is done more responsibly. So that's going to be a big personal priority for me over the coming year. We are going to have hearings about it. I'm reasonably confident now that the House will be putting forward legislation on social media reform, and that my bill will be part of it. And then we'll have to see where it goes from there. I have some interest in the Senate as well, so that's good news, and from some folks in the Biden administration. So I'm sure we'll have lots of opportunities to talk about that over the next year or so. So anyway, that's the stuff we're working on. That's what I'm working on. All of these things are, every bill we work on is designed to solve some problem. It's designed to help people. But cumulatively, my hope is that the work we're doing solves another problem in our country, and that is it begins to restore some of the faith that people have lost in Congress and in their government. The cynicism that eventually leads to presidential candidates who have no real platform other than to say, I'm just going to smash everything to pieces. When people lose faith in their government, that's what we get. And so I want to show that you take your responsibilities as citizens seriously. You elect good, decent, pragmatic people. We're going to get things done that are going to help you, that make everybody's life in this country better. And hopefully that becomes a virtuous cycle in the years to come. So thank you guys so much for having me, and I look forward to your thoughts and questions over the time we have. You're muted, Leslie.
Okay. Thank you for your work on our behalf. We truly do appreciate it. We had pre-registration and allowed participants to put forth some questions. So I have a series of questions that were entered prior to today, and then Michal will take questions that people are now entering into the chat sector. So let me share with you some areas that people would like you to speak to. We have a question. Can you discuss the flood of past and proposed state voter registration legislation?
Sure. Remember, I said a moment ago that we pass bills to solve a problem. And that's true. When, anytime members of Congress get together to propose a bill, and especially when they really work hard to pass it, they have some problem in mind that they're trying to solve. Otherwise, what's the point of making the effort? And so the first question we have to ask about these laws that are being proposed and in some cases passed in states like Georgia and Texas is what problem are you trying to solve? In Georgia, for example, the leadership of the state, the governor, the secretary of state, to their great credit, when President Trump was pressuring them to throw out the election results, they said, no, like the election was fine. They said it was the most secure election in our history. And they did a manual recount and they did audits, they did everything. And every single time they found that there had been no problems. So what is the problem that they're trying to solve? Plainly, it is not voter fraud. It is that from their point of view, the wrong people won. Too many of the wrong people voted and the wrong people won. And so the fundamental motivation behind these laws, I think, is deeply, deeply suspect. For some people, I think for some of the proponents, it's still based on the lie that there was some fraud in the election, but most of them have to acknowledge that there wasn't. And so what's left is this real motivation, which I think is a partisan one. It's about making it harder for people to vote, particularly in some of these states, African-American voters, urban voters who they expect will be voting for Democrats. What can be done about it? Well, courts can do a lot about it. Voters and activists in these states can do a lot about it by just not being deterred from voting. I'm a member of Congress, so I have to focus on what Congress can do about it. And we have two pieces of legislation, at least, that are designed to address it. One is H.R. 1, which I think most of you have heard of by now, which basically, it's a big, sprawling bill, but basically it comes down to two things. We should make it easier for people to vote and harder for billionaires to buy elections. Those are the two big parts of the bill. And on the easier to vote part, it would require states to have early voting and mail voting and drop boxes and nonpartisan commissions to draw up districts and all kinds of things to make voting easier and more secure and designed to serve the interest of voters, not politicians. And then we have H.R. 4, which is the renewal of the 1965 Civil Rights Act. And what that basically does is to undo the gutting of the Civil Rights Act by the Supreme Court several years ago by giving the federal government some supervisory authority once again over election rule changes in states that have a history of voter suppression. And that's something we're going to pass in the House later this year after some hearings, after gathering evidence. And then we have the Senate. And both of these bills will, I think, force a reckoning in the United States Senate over voting rights. We may see a showdown of sorts between voting rights and the filibuster. And that's kind of a daily drama that, for those of you who follow it, it involves Senator Manchin of West Virginia and his very complicated and not always consistent views. And we're going to work through those issues very, very carefully over the coming weeks and months. And at the end of the day, there's going to be a vote on voting rights. And hopefully under rules that allow a majority of senators to do what the overwhelming majority of the American people want, which is to make voting easy and secure for as many people as possible.
Thank you. We have another question about the U.S. funding of the Palestinian Authority in light of the stipends provided by the Palestinian Authority to families of terrorists.
That's an issue. On my last trip to Israel, we had a meeting with Mr. Abbas, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, and his whole team. There were, I don't know, maybe 30 members of Congress in the room, and I took the lead in challenging him on this issue. Partly, you guys may know, my background is in human rights, and I wanted to take the lead on this because, I used to work for an organization that was very sympathetic to defending the human rights of the Palestinian people. And so I told him that, but take it from me, this is unacceptable. These policies have to change. And it's also in US law, right, that these policies have to change. And those standards and those legal requirements still apply to every single penny of assistance that gets provided to the Palestinian people and the Palestinian Authority. At the same time, I do support very strongly cooperation with the PA on security issues, which virtually everybody in the Israeli security establishment, military and intelligence, absolutely want us to be doing for obvious reasons. I very much want the United States to be contributing humanitarian funding that benefits ordinary Palestinians directly, whether it's healthcare, vaccinations, educational programs, educational exchanges. We are in a situation right now where there's no hope in the present moment for a comprehensive two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But where I strongly believe we still need to maintain hope in that kind of solution for the future when there's better leadership able to seize that future moment. And the only way to maintain that hope is to continue to invest in people and to create opportunities for building confidence and cooperation that that allows this thing to get resolved later on, rather than just creating another, generation of Palestinians who feel like their only option is to lash out at their own leaders and at Israel. So I support what the Biden administration is doing here, which is restoring a lot of that humanitarian and security funding that I think was kind of gratuitously ended by the last administration, while maintaining restrictions that are designed to leverage changes that we need from the Palestinian Authority, including the payment to families of accused terrorists.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for responding. We have another question, or your thoughts and plans, or thoughts about the prospects of DC statehood.
DC statehood, I've always been for it, first of all, for the simple reason that I think every American living in America should have voting representation in the US Congress, and shouldn't be a radical point of view. The idea that we have hundreds of thousands of tax-paying American citizens living in America who can't vote for a senator or a member of Congress, it just makes no sense to me. And so, it is actually part of HR 1, at least the version that we passed in the House, where I think in the next couple of weeks, we're going to pass standalone legislation on DC statehood. So again, that comes back to the Senate. And here, I'm not even going to pretend that we can get 60 votes in the US Senate, because this is viewed by my Republican colleagues as a partisan cause, given that it is likely that the two senators that would be elected by the new state of Columbia would be Democrats. And I get it. They don't want two more Democrats, right? Politics is a partisan business. Democrats probably wouldn't want two more Republicans, right? Taken out of the hat and added to the US Senate. But be that as it may, if you take partisanship out of it and just ask what is the right thing to do, there's really only one right answer. And that is, again, everyone should be able to vote for a senator or House member. And the two parties should then compete on a fair playing field. And in fact, there's absolutely no reason why, even with the addition of two senators from Columbia, why the Republican Party couldn't compete and win again and again and again in America's political future. They just have to probably adjust a little bit to an electorate that is slightly more urban, right? That is slightly more representative of what America really is. And that would be healthy. It wouldn't mean they would lose. It would mean there would be a healthier two-party system in our country. And so I am very much for it. Again, this all gets wrapped up in the debate over the filibuster, though.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your comment about throwing yourself on the tracks. Please don't do that. Because the next question pertains to the infrastructure. It's, I will read the question. As we focus on the crumbling infrastructure and hopefully build the Gateway Tunnel from New Jersey to New York. How do we make sure this is fully funded by the federal government? New Jersey has too long been a giver state and not gotten its fair share in return. This has put more pressure on New Jersey taxpayers, and the taker states have used these funds to give companies more tax breaks and fund things with New Jersey money.
Yeah, that is well put. That's exactly right. Uh, we're one of the only states in the country for which there is no federal budget deficit, at least before all the COVID spending, in the sense that we get less back from the federal government than we send to Washington in taxes every single year. And some of that is because we are wealthier than average state, and we don't have tons of military bases, and 90% of our state isn't national forest, national park owned by the federal government. But it's also because of a tax system that is still overly burdens middle class folks, and the federal government underinvesting year after year after year in the things that benefit states like New Jersey, education, infrastructure in particular. And so that's one of the things that really drives me to get this infrastructure bill done and to do it in an ambitious way. We are an older state, right? So our roads and bridges and tunnels, our pipes tend to be older, in greater need of repair. And we have all kinds of opportunities that could be unlocked. So for example, when we build that gateway tunnel, the Hudson River Tunnel, we're going to go from 2 railway tracks connecting New Jersey and New York under the Hudson to 4. We're going to double the capacity. That will enable us, for example, to get full one-seat ride, direct service to New York on all the trains on the Raritan Valley line. So if anybody's, Westfield or Cranford or Garwood on that line, that's a huge, huge deal. Not to mention, unlocking all kinds of economic opportunities and making for an easier commute for people who are going to New York City. So Trump was against it because we were for it, and we had that fight for 4 years. I managed, with the help of, not alone, but very much, with a handful of other members from the region, to overcome the former administration's resistance to part of the project. We got funding and approval for the Portal Bridge, which is one of the bridges you cross before you get to the tunnel, just as in need of repair and replacement. And with Biden in there and Mayor Pete now as Secretary Pete, we now have their support for the tunnel. I've got a whole checklist of things for them to go through, administrative steps that they need to go through to approve it. I had an exchange with Secretary Pete at a hearing a couple of weeks ago, in which he committed to me that the next key step, which is getting the environmental impact statement for the tunnel done, will be done by the end of the second quarter of this year. So basically the end of the spring.
Okay.
For funding, that's on Congress. And that's where this big infrastructure bill comes in. We are proposing in this bill to create a special funding program for infrastructure projects of great regional and national significance that are too big to be funded by existing transportation department grants. All of that is code language for the Gateway Tunnel. So look, one way or another, we're going to take care of this. And that'll be a difference, right? That didn't just happen inevitably. It happened because we elected leaders who really believe in this stuff and who are going to fight for it.
Okay, thank you. My last question before I turn it over to Mikhail. Um, how do we get both sides of the aisle to work together for the citizens and not for their corporate donors? Is repeal of the state and local tax deduction limitations in the current tax bill?
Okay, so those are two different questions.
Yes.
There is no current tax bill yet. President Biden has proposed two big spending bills, right? One on infrastructure,
Right.
and then the second one, TBD, it will focus on things like education, community college, student loans, investing in our workforce. And both of those bills will have tax proposals attached to them to pay for the things that we're doing. And what I have said is that I cannot vote for a bill that has meaningful tax impacts for you, for my constituents. And really, we're talking about individual rates, the estate tax, things that affect individuals, unless it addresses the SALT deduction issue.
Okay.
And I got a handful of my colleagues, Democrats in the House, to do a letter with me to the administration saying this: we can't vote for a bill that doesn't help us on SALT if it, raises your taxes in some other ways. So that's that's our opening salvo.
Okay.
And what I can tell you honestly is that the more legislation actually moves through the process, the more leverage we will have to demand some fix on SALT. And if it's not moving, then not much I can do. But I think we've got a decent shot this year
Good.
to get some relief.
Okay.
Thanks.
I'll turn the questioning over to Mikhail now. I see we have some questions in our chat box.
Yeah,
Mikhail?
so thanks again for being here. So the Chasics had a quick question, and then I have some longer questions. One is, what's the title of the bill you introduced on social media and hate speech called? Like, what's the title?
It's the Protecting Americans from Dangerous Algorithms Act.
All right, so here's a longer question from Andy Seltzer. What are the prospects for sensible gun control legislation, especially when the public is very much behind at least universal background checks at a minimum?
Thanks. And I realize I didn't answer the bipartisan cooperation part of the previous question, but I think I can apply it here.
Okay.
It's a really good example of the big dilemma we face on bipartisanship. There are a bunch of issues that are totally bipartisan with the American people. And one of them is universal background checks for gun purchases, right? 90 or so % of Americans think that that's obviously a sensible thing to do. Most gun owners, most Republicans, most Democrats. And yet, I don't think we could get 60 votes in the Senate right now, even for universal background checks. We just passed it in the House. We also passed a bill closing a loophole that enables people to purchase a gun before their background check is complete, which in Charleston, South Carolina, enabled the shooter who went into that African-American church to get a gun, even though he was, would have failed his background check had they waited 3 days. So we passed those two in the House. We had some, handful of Republicans cross the aisle, but I don't think we have 60 votes right now in the Senate. So we can force a vote because Chuck Schumer is the majority leader. He can call this up anytime and force every senator to say yes or no. I think, he's going to try before we do that, working with Senator Manchin and some of the moderate Republicans to see if there's some common ground here that can be forged. And if so, great. But if not, then the prospect, again, will depend on whether there's some reform to the filibuster rules.
Thanks so much. Here's a question about the border. What do you think should happen in the immediate short term to address the crisis currently unfolding at the border with the flow of unaccompanied minors and families, to allow those fleeing violence to have a safe harbor to make asylum claims, while ensuring that housing facilities are not overwhelmed so they cannot safely house minors? Have organizations in the district helped to resettle refugees and received unaccompanied minors from the border with Texas? And this is from Jody Danis.
Yeah, but we do have lots of organizations, including faith-based organizations in New Jersey, that have traditionally helped to resettle refugees and asylum seekers. The refugee program, as you know, was completely shut down by the Trump administration. Asylum pretty much shut down as well. I always remind people the historical roots of our asylum and refugee programs in the United States. It comes down to the shame that we felt and that we should still feel and always feel over turning back Jewish refugees fleeing Hitler before World War II. Out of that came the principle that people can ask for asylum. They can ask for shelter and protection in our country. They aren't entitled to get it. We can say no, but they have a right to ask, to make their case, under the principle that those with a credible fear of persecution in their home countries should be given shelter by somebody. So that gets back to the question. There is a recurring significant problem at the US-Mexican border. Right now, we're in the middle of a surge that is very, very challenging for communities along the border to handle. But this has been happening every couple of years for 20 years. It's not a new thing. The real crisis, in my view, is in Central America. It's in Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador. It is not easy or normal for families to uproot themselves, to give up their country, their community, their language, and start anew somewhere else. I experienced this in my own family. I was 6 years old when I did it. It was, at that age, it's pretty easy, but for my mom, it was not easy. People only do this for the most part because they feel they have to. And in this case, because of very real violence that a lot of these folks are experiencing in their communities. And so one of the things we have to do, recognizing it's hard and it will take time, is to invest in efforts to address the violence and the natural disasters and economic dislocation in these Central American countries that pushes people to make that very, very dangerous journey. And then, when people do come here, I think, we shouldn't be afraid. I often say to my Republican colleagues, who are, some of whom, not all of them, but some of whom making this into a big fear-mongering issue right now, that, we're supposed to agree that the United States has adversaries around the world, that we're in this contest now with China. They're always talking about the Chinese Communist Party and how they're our enemy. And I'm like, our biggest advantage over China is that all these people around the world want to become American citizens. They want to become American taxpayers. They want to become, in many cases, American soldiers. They want to come here and work their hearts out and contribute to our country. And some of them are going to invent vaccines in 20 years, right? And nobody wants to go to China and do that. Nobody, right? Why would we voluntarily give up our greatest comparative advantage? So absolutely, we should have border security. We shouldn't have people sneaking across the border. We should decide, the US government should decide who comes here and who doesn't. But we should be generous in making those decisions, and we should understand that we have a self-interest in continuing to keep America as a country of immigrants. And so, you know, I don't want to be defensive on this issue. I think, you know, I think we need to be championing that concept against those who would make immigration into something to fear.
Thank you. One more question back to voting, and then Andrea Stein would like to ask a question. So this is from Stephen and Amanda Greenblatt. They want to know, what can and should we be doing to help ensure that HR 1 is approved by the Senate? If we allow voter suppression to continue, we will not be able to elect the kind of politicians you described that we need.
Yeah. That's a hard question to answer, in part because, you know, we're New Jerseyans, and if you support HR 1, you've got 2 senators who support HR 1 passionately. And, you know, you can call Mitch McConnell's office, but he doesn't care what you think if you're not from his state. I think just keep this issue front and center, even with your senators, even with your congressman who obviously supports HR 1. It's helpful to hear from constituents about it because it reminds us that this needs to be a priority. I'm for 1,000 things. I can't prioritize 1,000 things. And so when I hear from constituents, and it's true of Menendez and Booker too, when we hear from constituents, this should be a priority, then, you know, it becomes our priority. So, you know, even though those senators don't need to be convinced, yeah, I think they still need to hear from you, and people in the community should be talking about this. You know, beyond that, I don't want to get too partisan here, but, you know, remember New Jersey's role in maintaining, in deciding the balance in the House of Representatives and the Senate every 2 years. And, you know, we have a very, very close margin in both the House and the Senate right now. And it does matter. Even those of us committed to bipartisanship have to acknowledge it does matter which side controls the agenda. And New Jersey has a very important role to play in making that decision. So.
Okay, so we're just going to have, thank you so much. We're going to have Andrea Stein ask her question. I'm just going to try to locate her so I can spotlight her.
I see her.
Hi, Tom. You don't have to spotlight me, Michal.
Oh, okay, good, because I can't find you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for all you do. This question sort of piggybacks on Amanda's question and on the question, I think it was Andy Seltzer's, about gun violence. Given that I think those of us here support the same goals, what is the best way for all of us to support the kinds of things that you are trying to do? How can we help move things forward? And I know you're not going to get political here.
Yeah. Well, there is a political answer to that, of course, but, you know, again, it comes back a little bit to the, you know, the challenge of, well, we've done so well in New Jersey, right? And sometimes I kind of tongue-in-cheek apologize, like, I'm sorry that we've got all these representatives in New Jersey who are doing what you want already, and our state government has already passed great voter protection rules and great gun control rules, because it gives us less to do, right? We've already done it. We've made New Jersey, and we should be proud of this. New Jersey is the policy leader in this country. We've done a lot of the things that many of us are urging Congress and the federal government to do on protecting the environment, protecting our kids from gun violence. The way in which we managed the last election was a model, I think. And So where you as active voting citizens in New Jersey have the greatest influence, you've already exerted it, right? You've already won most of those arguments. But I think, looking at the rest of the country, of course, those of us who have the means to do so can support a lot of wonderful organizations on voting rights, for example, that are leading the charge in these states, that are doing the legal actions, that are registering voters, that are doing the grassroots work. Stacey Abrams' organization, for example, in Georgia, that have been so successful in mobilizing large numbers of people to register and vote. The voter suppression we are seeing right now is in some ways a kind of defensive reaction against the success of that very constructive, positive activism over the last several years. And that's something everybody can support, wherever we may live. So that would be one thought.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea.
Leslie, anything last to mention?
We had someone that had asked to be unmuted here. Let's see.
I have a question if we're able to take another one. It's Sue
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to.
Okay.
Agree that it's very desirable to try to work across the aisle, have bipartisan solutions to our common problems. It must be particularly difficult, however, after the January 6th event. I remember Congresswoman Cheryl noted that she had seen some of your colleagues provide tours for some of the people who then stormed the Capitol the next day. Nothing's been said about the follow-up on that. How are you resolving those tensions that inevitably must exist among members of Congress, given that history?
Well, some of these things are still being investigated. It's certainly true that, look, I have colleagues in the House who were very friendly with the groups that organized the riot in the Capitol, right? Met with their leaders and went to their events and their meetings. And then some of them tried to wash their hands of the whole thing. And, the policy of most of my Republican colleagues who were involved with that mess was let the rioters take the fall. And I had nothing, I never knew those people, but of course they did. So that's being investigated. Was it just an innocent tour, or was they actually casing the joint? Right? We don't know yet. Your broader question is, how do we deal with them while still trying to be bipartisan? And in a way, we had a helpful. January 6th was helpful in delineating who was who. There was a group of Republicans in the House and the Senate, mostly in the House, who voted with the rioters not to certify the election, even after we went back into the chamber that evening. And so there's a list, those who voted yes and those who voted no. And I was not happy that so many voted against certifying the election, but I was happy to see when I looked at that list that most of the Republicans I work with, co-sponsor bills with, have friendly relationships with, were not on that list. They voted with the Constitution. They voted to put country over party. And so I feel like, it was not an event that ended a lot of relationships for me, because the relationships I had were with the ones who are on the right side. And many of us have made a particular effort since then to actually reach out to those who did the right thing, to the smaller number who voted to impeach President Trump, small but not insignificant historically, and to give them opportunities to work with us, to co-sponsor legislation that's moving, to lift them up as much as we can. So that's something I've I've tried to do. I have very little interest in working with the others, frankly, but I don't need to. Bipartisanship, successful bipartisanship right now means, can we find 10 or 20 Republican senators? Can we find 30 or 40 or even 10 or 15 Republican members of the House to help us pass legislation? That is bipartisanship in this moment. And we can do that while at the same time, I think, properly shunning the cuckoo caucus,
Thank you.
putting them in their proper place. Thank you, Susan.
So I just want to thank Leslie, first of all, for organizing this, for bringing the congressman to our congregation, and for her tireless efforts to make sure that that event last year didn't just get forgotten. So thank you, Leslie. And to you, thank you, Congressman, for joining us, for sharing your honest insights into what it's like to be on the Hill now, and also the connections between Washington and our community, and the ways in which you're representing our interests and our desire to see not only benefits for ourselves, but also justice in the community in general. So thank you for all that you do, for your partnership. And thank you to the members of the synagogue community who joined us to, again, say we are our best selves when we participate in the process, and when we see ourselves as people with a voice. And so it was a great afternoon, and I appreciate everyone's participation, your questions. And thank you again, Congressman, for being with us and for continuing to do the work that you do.
Thank you so much. Look forward to doing this again.
In person with wine and
In
cheese.
person with wine and cheese.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you,
I seem to
everyone.
remember good bagels at some point too, but anyway, we'll talk,
okay.
we'll negotiate.
That's
We
right.
can negotiate. We
All righty.
are good negotiators. Thank you
Wine
so
and
much
bagel.
again.
Thank you, everybody. Be safe, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Weekend.
You
Shabbat
take
shalom.
care.